what we were looking at is what's driving the current inflation that we're seeing. What we see is disruptions because of COVID, because of our globalized supply system, where a minor disruption in one area may have ripple effects throughout the system. And of course, there's also pricing power by large corporations, and that's playing into the current inflation as well. And this is in the context of calls for the Fed to raise interest rates. So we just wanted to see whether raising interest rates can be helpful for inflation.
They don't know if they're stepping on the brake or the gas pedal. If you ask any economist, what happens if oil prices go up? Well, inflation will go up. What happens if rents go up? Well, prices and inflation will go up. What happens if wages go up? Well, prices and inflation will go up. What happens if interest rates go up? Well, prices and inflation go down. Why? For lots of firms, interest is a bigger cost than any of those other things. Why would they reduce their prices when their interest costs are going up? It just makes no sense.
This is the MMT Podcast with Patricia and Christian Riley. Hi, I'm Christian Riley and welcome to the Modern Monetary Theory Podcast. You can find us on Twitter at MMT Podcast, and you can support the show by going to patreon.com/MMT Podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. A big thank you to all of our supporters so far. At the beginning there, you heard our guests this week, economists Randall Wray and Yeva Nersisyan. And in a moment, we're going to be talking to them about their latest paper on the causes of the inflation impacting the US and also the rest of the world's economies right now. If you're new to MMT, you might want to check out our first 3 episodes for an easy-to-understand introduction. But if you want to dive in here, as regular listeners will know, money's just made up. Actually, I don't like saying it like that because it sounds like I'm saying it's a trivial matter. And I hate to get all serious, but it's kind of a life and death issue. So maybe it's better to say that money's constructed, which is kind of obvious, but the crucial ingredient of its construction is one that most of us aren't encouraged to pay attention to. The crucial element of money's construction isn't the paper it's printed on, or the metal used to make coins, or the data used to store your bank balance on your bank's electronic ledger system. The crucial element of money's construction, what makes it money as we know it, is the relationship it puts you in with regard to the issuer of it. What do I mean by that? Well, to paraphrase economist Hyman Minsky, anyone can create money. The problem is getting people to accept it. And the way governments who create the money we use, the way they get people to accept their money is by choosing a token, a unit of account that only they can issue. In the UK, our government calls these tokens pounds. And to get us to accept pounds, the government demands that we, the private sector, pay taxes back to them, the issuer of pounds, in pounds. So the government creates money like anyone can, but it gets us to accept its money by imposing tax liabilities on us denominated in its unit of account. That's the crucial ingredient. The government gets you to accept its money by putting you in a debtor relationship to itself. We owe the government pounds for taxes, and that's why here in the UK, we're using pounds for our domestic transactions rather than pebbles or seashells or this £1 trillion note I just made out of a napkin. The important thing to note is the sequence. The government has to put their tokens, their money, into the economy first before anybody can have any of it to pay their taxes. So spending has to come before taxation. Your government doesn't use your tax payment for its spending money. Taxation removes money from the system. The government uses taxation to get you to need its money to allow it to spend that money into existence to do the things it was put in charge of doing. And sorry about this, take a sip of coffee. Okay, you back? Okay, deep breath. The private sector also influences the level of credit in circulation by borrowing money into existence. Oh, what do I mean by that? Well, when private sector individuals or firms want to spend money they don't yet have, they can go to a bank and swap their promise to pay money in the future for bank credit, because commercial banks have been deputized by the government to create new credit money for creditworthy customers. And you can listen to our episode 126 for more details on how that works. So the big picture is that the government spends new money into existence, and that spending is constrained by a parliamentary or congressional budgeting process, and the government also lends new money into existence via its agents, which are commercial banks. And the government influences the level of that lending by changing interest rates, by making it more or less expensive for private sector firms and individuals to take out loans. And deciding on and maintaining the interest rate is known as monetary policy. So what does this mean for us, the insignificant mortals who merely make and ship all the stuff that at the end of the day our money systems were brought into being to bring about the production and distribution of? Well, given that the flow of money circulating in the economy isn't limited by an amount of precious metal stored in a vault somewhere, but rather by government policy, at times like these, with prices of certain key goods and services rising, instead of asking how we can change our system of production and consumption to bring those prices down and, maybe not kill the planet as a side benefit, instead of focusing on real material change that might sustain us, we're asked to consider whether or not we've spent too much money. So how do we determine if we, through our political system, through our government, how do we determine if we've issued too much or too little money into the economy? Well, the great many of us who have experienced stagnating real wages, precarious employment and unemployment, who have perhaps lost family members due to unaffordable or inadequate healthcare, we might think that we have an idea about what too little spending money in an economy looks like. But that's where we'd be wrong. According to the very clever people in charge of these things, this is actually what too much money in the economy looks like. Too much money in an economy is when low-wage workers are able to ask for higher wages and in some cases actually get them. And those people being paid too much is the very definition of inflation. And so, for instance, the governor of the Bank of England has requested that workers don't ask for wage increases to help him fight inflation. Unfortunately, he can't lead the charge in that respect, because if he gave back his six-figure salary, that would interfere with price signals. So it's down to the rest of us to pick up the baton. And unfortunately, we're not cooperating. And so what will have to happen now is a thing they like to call monetary tightening. In other words, raising interest rates. And the thinking is that if it becomes more expensive to borrow money, we'll all stop borrowing for trivial things like survival. Businesses will cut back on borrowing for trivial things like continuing to do business. There'll be less money flowing, and if we get it right, businesses will close and our pool of unemployed people, which is a permanent feature of a monetary economy, that pool of unemployed people will expand to its natural level, as written about but weirdly never defined in Scripture. It's important that the people in that pool of unemployed humans don't die, because if they all died, we'd technically be at full employment, and workers would start getting uppity again, demanding toilet breaks and other luxuries, so we have to pay the unemployed just enough so that they don't die. I mean, we can afford for lots of them to die, and the UK government do pretty well on that front, but just not all of them. Of course, at the stroke of a pen, that pool of people wouldn't have to be unemployed. They could actually be guaranteed a job, paid at a socially inclusive wage to do useful things, which was the whole point of having a money system in the first place. And the government, the issuer of currency, certainly wouldn't run out of money to make that happen, but it would change the level of precarity for workers. And again, their demands might distract our hardworking trillionaires from their spaceship building. For more on this wacky proposal for not killing people because some prices went up, and for bringing about full employment with price stability, namely the job guarantee, you can listen to our episodes 4 and 47. And because inflation's a complex phenomena that the geniuses in charge of fighting it have stated they have no working theory of, Once again, it's down to us to pick up the baton. And so for more on inflation, you can listen to our episodes 65, 104, and 123. And that last one is with MMT founder Warren Mosler, and it's all about his most recent thinking on the topic. I've linked to all of the above in the show notes for this episode, along with some other things that came up in the conversation. And as ever, I've linked to where you can support this podcast financially via patreon.com/MMT podcast. Support starts at $1 a month or £1 a month or whatever the equivalent is wherever you live. And no matter what level of support you give, you get early access to all of our episodes and patron-only episodes where you can ask me and Patricia MMT questions. We're 100% listener funded. Your financial support really helps keep the show going, and your support in other ways, whether it's by recommending us to other people or just by listening and spreading the word about this stuff, really helps too. So thanks as ever for the time you put into understanding MMT. Let's dive in. Welcome one and all to the MMT podcast. I'm Christian Riley.
And I'm Patricia Pino.
And we are doubly honored to be joined today, not only by primary MMT academic and author of Understanding Modern Money, Professor L. Randall Wray. Hi, Randy.
Hi.
We are doubly honored because joining us for the first time, we have macroeconomist and author of many papers, but in particular, co-author of a brand new paper that we're going to be talking about in a moment. So we're delighted to welcome Professor Yeva Nersisyan. Hi, Yeva.
Hi, thank you.
So your new paper is entitled What's Causing Accelerating Inflation, Pandemic, or Policy Response? Yeva, could you lay out in the broad strokes what you guys found?
Yeah, so what we were looking at is what's driving the current inflation that we're seeing. And this is in the context of calls for the Fed to raise interest rates. And the Fed is gearing up to raise interest rates soon. So we just wanted to see whether the Fed raising interest rates can be helpful for inflation. And to understand that, first you have to understand where inflation is coming from. And there has been a lot of arguments from mainstream economists such as Larry Summers, and it seems like Paul Krugman has joined in as well, saying that it's a demand problem, that there is too much demand in the economy, and that's what's driving inflation. And of course, why is it that we have so much demand? It's because of policy. In particular, they blame the third round of stimulus when Biden came into office, the $1.9 trillion relief bill that was passed. So they're blaming it on that. And our argument is that even though demand has recovered, it hasn't really surpassed the pre-pandemic levels, at least not by very much. And instead, what we see is a problem of inability of the supply side to adjust to the current situation. And that's because of disruptions, because of COVID, because of our globalized supply system, where a minor disruption in one area may have ripple effects throughout the system. And of course, there is also the argument of pricing power by companies, by large corporations, and how that's playing into the current inflation as well. So we basically conclude that it's a pandemic issue. It's not really a policy issue. You could always argue that by keeping Americans poorer and not giving as much relief, maybe we wouldn't see as much inflation. But of course, that would not have solved the supply side problems. They would still be there even without demand having recovered.
At the beginning of the paper, you write about what's kept inflation low in places like the US and the UK. I mean, you're focusing on the US, but it generalizes what's kept inflation low in places like this until now. And also, just in case anybody's forgotten, central banks were struggling to cause inflation. They were undershooting their inflation targets for quite some time until the pandemic. But anyway, perhaps, Randy, could you lay out some of that history for us?
Sure. So if you wanted a one-word answer as to why inflation had been low for several decades before the pandemic, it was neoliberalism. So it was offshoring, it was the development of these supply chains, and most importantly, of low-wage labor abroad that replaced higher-paid workers in the rich countries. So that depressed wages in the rich countries too. Probably most of your listeners know that the real wage for American workers on average, has not risen since 1974. So that was part of the process of keeping wages low and keeping prices low. But also the development of these supply chains and the development of neoliberal ideology, which includes concentration of economic power in the hands of fewer firms and trying to reduce costs everywhere you possibly can reduce them. So supply chains was one of those, wage reduction was one of those, but also reduction of inventories and getting these long-term contracts from suppliers, but also from retailers that favor the biggest firms. And the result of using the supply chains and getting rid of inventories and getting rid of competition from domestic producers is that if there's any disruption of the supply chain, then we're in big trouble. And that's exactly what happened. So the pandemic exposed that. We'd already seen a problem with an earthquake in Taiwan some years ago, but this one really exposed the weaknesses and fragility of this kind of a production system.
To me, is a really refreshing explanation what you've just given, because from a lot of papers, they've tried to explain, why were central banks struggling to hit inflation targets since the recession. And some of those explanations are about inflation expectations and something about anchoring of expectations, as well as other explanations would be just simply technological advancements, which means that wages have depressed. Randy, what do you think about these explanations?
The way I always put it is that expectations converge to reality, not the other way around. There have been people expecting the second coming for about 2,000 years. And reality just does not converge to expectations. It has to be the reverse. And all the data shows that. So the Fed, the ECB, the Bank of England, they all engaged in trillions and trillions and literally trillions of dollars, of yen, of euros, pounds of quantitative easing. And this was supposed to raise the expectations of inflation, and therefore we would get some inflation, because the problem was that we were all below what central bankers think is a good inflation rate, which is 2%, which is another matter entirely, why that would be a good number. But in any case, we were always below that. It never raised expectations. It had no impact on expectations, because the reality was, and everyone recognized the reality, that inflation is low. Now they're trying to do the opposite, trying to build the expectation that inflation is going to go down. Now, expectations have gone up a bit, but they've only followed the inflation up. Okay? It's not that expectations cause this inflation, and that's very, very clear, because short-term expectations, I think, have gotten to about 4%. Long-term expectations about 3%, but in any case, actual inflation hit 7%. And so that indicates that it is inflation pulling up expectations.
Even people from within the Fed have been saying that the Fed doesn't really have a working theory of inflation, that they really don't know what they're doing and how expectations are even supposed to affect inflation. The idea is that if workers expect higher inflation, they're going to negotiate for higher wages, and that's then going to lead to higher prices, which then can get entrenched in the economy. I mean, leaving aside the issue of workers not negotiating for wages in any collective manner, in which case maybe there could be some sort of logical believability sort of to that theory. But leaving that aside, for this to even work, the Fed actually has to have a way of affecting inflation, right? So the Fed commits to lower inflation, and then workers say, okay, the Fed is committed, so we're not going to demand higher wages. But for that to work, the Fed actually has to have tools to affect inflation. And that's what it does not have, right? So what Randy was saying with QE, I think what they were trying there is this quantity theory, right? That you're just going to increase the amount of money in the economy, and because there is more money, people are going to expect higher inflation, and those inflation expectations will then lead to higher inflation. Of course, that didn't happen because quantity theory just does not work. There is no validity to that theory. So the only reasonable way to think about it is, okay, if the Fed changes the interest rates, let's say it raises them, then that might affect spending in the economy, so interest-sensitive spending, and by lowering spending, the Fed can then have some impact on inflation. So that's really the only reasonable sort of transmission mechanism that's out there. And there isn't a lot of evidence for changes to the interest rate affecting spending. Definitely not marginal changes. Now, if you were to raise interest rates to 20%, of course, that could crash the economy and that could lower spending. But these marginal changes to the interest rate are not really going to dissuade consumers from spending. And in this case in particular, because the spending is not driven by debt, right? It's driven by income. So there is an inconsistency in the argument. On the one hand, they're saying it's stimulus by Congress that's causing the inflation. On the other hand, they're saying we're going to raise rates and we're going to lower borrowing. But if people are spending their income, how is that going to have any impact on the economy?
You say in the paper, in the areas where prices are being pushed up, that kind of spending is not driven by credit. People don't borrow to pay their rent. They don't borrow to buy food.
This inflation is a bit different than the high inflation we had at the end of the 70s. But if you look at the components of the consumer basket that drive inflation, it turns out they pretty much are the same. If you go back to Jimmy Carter's high inflation, that it's really run all through the 70s, it was caused by OPEC oil prices. It was caused by food prices, but food is very closely related to oil in ways that we could get into. And then the third component is shelter. Shelter includes what people actually pay for rent, plus this imputed rental to homeowners, because most Americans own their own home. And so, they're not paying rent out of their pocket, but these statisticians impute a rental equivalent, what the home would have been worth if they had rented it. And so it's very confused to put this into your inflation measure for the purposes of policy, because it does not move with actual housing prices. The short of this is that, as Yeva was saying, these things are not going to be closely related to the interest rate. People don't borrow to pay rent. They don't borrow to fuel their car. And they don't borrow to go buy groceries. And so the whole idea is let's raise interest rates and then people will borrow less and spend less. But our inflation doesn't come from the things that people are borrowing to buy. We also don't have an investment boom in the United States. And so it's not going to reduce investment spending, and we should not want that anyway. What we need to do is invest, especially in the areas that are going to reduce our dependency on oil. But we need infrastructure investment. We need housing investment. We have a tremendous housing shortage because we basically have not been building since the global financial crisis. So anyway, rents are going up, and raising interest rates, if anything, is going to make it worse because we're not going to build more housing for people to solve the housing shortage. So it's just not plausible that raising interest rates is the right policy.
And just to take a step back to something that Yeva brought up, with QE, the idea was we're possibly going to generate the expectation of accelerating inflation because there's more money in the economy now because we're doing QE. The central banks are doing QE, but banks don't lend out reserves to their retail customers. It's not like QE isn't giving banks a surplus of money, but they won't lend it out. I think that was a misunderstanding as well.
the whole thing with QE was kind of convoluted because it was called quantitative easing, but then researchers from the Fed were saying, well, it's actually not the quantity it's supposed to work through. It's through interest rates. So by, say, buying longer term treasury securities, the Fed is going to push up the price of those securities and push down long-term interest rates. And that's how it's supposed to have an impact on the economy. Really, it's not through the quantity. So there was a lot of confusion around that, right? Is it the quantity? Is it the price? How is it supposed to help? And if it's really working on interest rates, so by lowering the 10-year interest rate by, say, 25 or to 50 basis points, right? How is that going to jumpstart the economy or increase inflation expectations, right? So that was pretty convoluted, I would say.
There's also this thing that central banks do called forward guidance. Could you say what that is and how it's used?
Well, the whole idea is that they're trying to control expectations, and so they're trying to tell you what they're going to do, and you will prepare for that and start thinking the same way that they're thinking. There's a whole backstory to this. The Fed never used to tell us what their target was until 1994. When Greenspan got caught lying to Congress. And that's when they decided to be transparent. And so now they are, Powell just told us what he's going to do next week, which is propose a 25 basis point hike. The Fed never would have done that in the past.
They're trying to basically tell us what they're going to do with interest rates in the next year or next 2 years, right? So we've known that a rate hike is coming in 2022 since the last quarter of 2021, at least, because the Fed has said that they are going to do it. They've said how many times they are likely to raise interest rates and even give us an idea of how big the steps are going to be, whether 25 basis points or more. So that's what the forward guidance is, right? They're not only setting the target for today, they're also telling us what they're going to do with interest rates in the next year or two. And as Randy said, the purpose is to try to get inflation expectations sort of to where they want them to be.
I really had to use this quote, which I'm going to pull out of this other recent paper that you wrote, Randy, co-authored with Dimitri B. Papadimitriou. You illustrate the problem with conventional monetarist thinking beautifully. You write, "We are reminded of the dog that stands at the window and barks as a jogger on the street gets closer to her house. The dog continues until the jogger passes by and reaches a distance considered to be safe. The dog is sure she has prevented a burglary. Proud of herself, she decides to begin barking earlier and longer at any jogger in sight. Then at kids playing in the yard across the street, at approaching and retreating cars, and at squirrels climbing trees, protecting the house from any possible invasion. The more she barks, the more effective she is. To do an even better job, she barks at the unseen threats, the unobservable burglars. That the house is never burglarized is proof that the barking works."
Yeah, and I mean, that was a little story, of course, but
Yeah.
you can find almost exactly those words being used at the FOMC meetings. They really, truly were saying, okay, there is no inflation that we can see in the data. Okay, there's nothing telling us that there's any inflation problem. But if we start raising rates now, it will show that we're fighting inflation before it even occurs. And that means we're doing an even better job. They actually say this in the meetings.
That's exactly, of course, what they did in 2017, I believe, under Janet Yellen, right? I think it was still Yellen. They started raising interest rates, or maybe it was already Powell, I don't remember. But they started raising interest rates even before there was any inflation in this previous recovery as well. And similarly, if inflation in 2022 turns out to be lower than it was in 2021, and the Fed has been raising rates, of course, they can then take credit for it. And they can say, well, see, we raised interest rates and we took inflation under control. And so then they can take credit for it just like they've done in the past few decades.
Before the pandemic, there was increasing number of papers and commentary talking about the flattening on the Phillips curve and nobody understood inflation, and particularly people saying, well, we've had QE and that was supposed to create inflation and it hasn't happened yet. And others saying that it would, but eventually it would cause inflation. And I'm wondering what you thought about when the pandemic hit. What impact did that have on those beliefs? Did they simply revert back to their previous understanding of inflation, or has that disrupted things even more?
Yeah, I think there is still this thinking, right? Because that's what the Fed is trying to do. They're still trying to work on inflation expectations. So in addition to raising interest rates, one of the things they're going to do is they're going to reverse QE, right? So unwind the Fed's position in bonds and other assets that it has purchased as a way of controlling inflation, even though there is really no logic to it, no reasoning for how the Fed selling the Treasury securities that it has previously purchased, how that's going to lead to controlling the inflation, lower inflation. So I don't know if there is a rethink. There have been those couple of papers, like you said before the pandemic, from insiders from the Fed, basically saying we don't really have a theory of inflation. I think it's too early to tell whether there is a rethink happening. Maybe Randy knows more about that.
Well, I wanted to say something about unemployment. As I said before, real wages have been flat for a very, very long time. That is not normal. It's not good for workers, and it's not good for the economy. Even the most mainstream theory says that real wages ought to grow along with labor productivity. And if they don't, you've got a big problem. You're going to have continually insufficient aggregate demand. I mean, you can't sell more to workers if their wages are not going up. So you've got a chronic problem. Before the pandemic, Larry Summers was warning that we were in secular stagnation. And the depressed wages contribute to that problem. So we actually want wages to go up, and they finally are going up. And, except for the CEO bonuses, which are outrageous, they mostly are concentrated among low wage workers. So this is exactly what we need. People say the labor market's too tight, and we've all walked by restaurants that have help wanted signs up. There is a problem of getting people willing to risk their lives in order to wait tables. So there's still a pandemic problem in getting people to do some kinds of work. But the reality is that we've still got 8 million people who most likely want to work. We are still, 2 million below the level of employment we had before the pandemic hit. And the surveys, we report on this in our paper, the surveys of firms just do not indicate that on average they're having trouble hiring labor. It's one of the least of their concerns, actually, right now. So I don't think labor markets are too tight. I don't think that the data shows this. It is not wages that are pushing up prices. It is supply chain disruptions, other kinds of disruptions, and pricing power that some firms have already taken advantage of. And the surveys do show that on average, firms are expecting to take advantage of pricing power. I'm talking about the ones that haven't done it yet. They are expecting that they're going to increase their markups. So that's where inflation is coming from. And because of this war, we're going to have OPEC and other oil producers are going to be raising prices because of the diminished supply coming from Russia. So we're going to continue to have some inflation pressure, but workers just are not really our problem. That is not what is causing the inflation.
In the How We Got Here section of your paper, you write about jobless recoveries fueling increasing inequality, but then that inequality often being blamed on this concept of a quote-unquote skills gap. Could you say more about that, why that's bad framing?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing in the current situation, so we talked about the jobless recoveries in our paper, and that's of course been putting this downward pressure on prices, right? By keeping the labor markets so loose rather than keeping them tight. We've had this situation of lower wages, and the claim is that that's because people don't have skills, right? We just need more education. We're just going to have to educate everybody, and And I guess if we were to educate everybody, I wonder what the argument would be then, right? That what is going to happen. But for me, the current situation is such a good example of what Warren Mosler was saying following the Great Recession, saying that we can always solve this problem with more demand, right? So it doesn't matter that it was a deep financial crisis. If we can add more demand, we will solve the problem of unemployment and joblessness and so on. Of course, the MMT preference isn't for this indiscriminate stimulus, but the argument was that you can, if you wanted to, create more demand and not have a jobless recovery, right? And this current situation shows us exactly that, right? And this goes back to Randy's point about Larry Summers and the secular stagnation, right? That somehow it's a different situation that we're dealing with, that we don't know how to solve this problem of secular stagnation. And now we can see that, no, we do, right? That it wasn't secular stagnation necessarily. It was all along a problem of austere fiscal policy and not sufficient demand in the economy because of what Randy was saying, because wages have not been keeping up with productivity, right? And the government was not filling that gap in any other way. And so we've had jobless recoveries, labor markets that weren't getting tight until, say, 10 years into the recovery, even if that. But now we can see that it doesn't have to be that way, that we can solve that problem very, very easily. The demand problem, the problem is what to do on the supply side, what to invest in to expand our productive capacity and to ensure that the gains are shared more widely.
Yeah, let me add one thing on the skills argument. If the economy is chronically operating with lots of unemployment, then it's very easy for firms to hire and to raise the credentials required for entry into jobs. So what we've had is massive credential inflation over the past 40 years, simply because firms can require degrees because it's so hard to get jobs. The pandemic has shown, I think, to a lot of firms that you don't really need those credentials. So they've had to lower their credential standards in order to fill jobs. This is a good thing. So having tighter labor markets will solve our supposed skills problem.
Yeah, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of job ads that require 5 years of experience, a master's degree, and then the salary is something like $15 an hour, or requiring 5 years of experience in a programming language that has only existed for like 2 years. So.
We see those here as well, and there was a shortage of lorry drivers for a while as well. And when you actually looked at the announcements and the ads for those jobs, they were actually very poorly paid, required you to basically work very bad hours and sleep very little and be away from home for a long time. So, and then they complain that, nobody wants to do these jobs anymore. And
I saw a very good Twitter comment where somebody said, if I can't get a Maserati for $50, there's not a Maserati shortage. Yeah.
Yeah, employers are so used to this loose labor market situation where they can hire who they want, whenever they want. So now that there's been a little bit of a tightening in the labor markets, they're screaming, there's a shortage.
So in the paper, you examine the sources of current price pressures, and let's look at them one at a time. We touched on oil and OPEC. Also, you've got transport and housing and food. So let's talk about how those inflationary pressures are working.
Of course, the famous one was used cars and trucks jumped by 40%. and so that feeds through to inflation. That's clearly not a problem of aggregate demand. People had postponed purchases, and then you couldn't buy new cars because they don't have the chips, so they can't produce them. And so used car prices go up. Okay, this is not something you want to fight with high interest rates. Then transport in general and shipping and all of that, there are tremendous problems in the shipping. And once you get it to the docks, then there are problems in trying to load those onto trucks and so on. So those prices have all gone up. They feed through. Almost everything you buy has got to be shipped, and the shipping prices have increased in some cases by 10 times higher shipping prices. And so, of course, that feeds through into inflation. The restaurants and hotels, those prices are also up. And it's not hard to see what's going on there. The costs of the cleaning and the protection of the employees, and also maintaining a distance, which means that you have fewer tables seated, so your costs are higher. So those get passed along.
Yeah, on the question of transport, I would say, first, it is kind of crazy that we're still talking about OPEC in 2022. And of course, we were talking about OPEC, although I wasn't here then, but, we're talking about OPEC in 1970s as well, right? So had we pivoted away from fossil fuels then and invested more in renewable energy, we wouldn't be talking about OPEC, and we wouldn't likely see this kind of inflation coming from oil prices. But on the question of cars, for instance, we can relate it back to fiscal policy, because fiscal policy, nobody expected Congress to act so forcefully and to actually inject a significant amount of spending into the economy, so provide significant amount of relief. I think the expectation was probably that they were going to do what they did after the Great Recession, which was this meager stimulus spending that led to this long jobless recovery and stagnating demand. So because of that, firms, of course, cut back on their production. I think the story with car manufacturers was that they canceled their orders of semiconductors. And then when they realized that, no, maybe we are going to be able to sell more cars, they then got at the back of the line of the semiconductor line, basically. So then they weren't able to get those. And they probably also lowered their spending on investment, right? So they didn't want to expand their capacity because they thought they weren't going to be able to sell so many cars. Now, had the expectation been that fiscal policy would have been adequate, maybe they would not have taken the steps. They would not have cut back their current production or their future investment plans. And therefore, we wouldn't see this decline in their ability to produce. So with this promise that fiscal policy would be able to better solve our demand problem, then perhaps going forward, we wouldn't have these kinds of situations where firms quickly cut on their investment spending because they're worried about the future.
In your paper, you write, what's important to keep in mind is that wages are playing catch up with prices rather than driving the price changes.
Well, yeah, I can't remember the numbers. Maybe Yeva can. But wage growth is well below the increase of the CPI, Consumer Price Index, measure of inflation. So they can't be the cause of inflation if they are running well below the inflation rate.
It was 4.4% as of the last quarter of 2021. That's the employment cost index. That's how much it increased by. And of course, the inflation rate, was something like 6.7 at that point.
Moving on, you note that many are now arguing that inflation is becoming entrenched, that it's not a temporary problem that will go away on its own. And you examine the evidence for that position.
Yeah, so if we go with what the Fed says, that they're looking at inflation expectations, and that's how they gauge whether inflation is becoming entrenched or not, then clearly it's not becoming entrenched, because even though short-term inflation expectations have gone up, and they've only gone up to something like 3.5%. So they haven't gone up to the 7%, which is what we're seeing. And obviously, when asked the question of what do you think price increases are going to be in the next 12 months, people are going to look at the current situation and the past situation, and they're going to say, they're going to give you a number that's higher than previously because of the current reality, right? So expectations converging to reality, which is what Randy was saying. But if you look at longer term inflation expectations, they haven't gone up by very much. So they have sort of hovered around this 2.5-3% range. And that's where they stand even currently. Now, when the Fed says inflation is becoming entrenched, I think what they're talking about is your previous point, which is where wages are starting to increase. So everything was fine until we saw wage increases, and now we have to act because wages are going up.
The wrong people's wages are going up.
And Randy can address this more because he wrote a paper years ago on this, that when there was inflation coming from markups, the Fed wasn't necessarily acting, but they were always acting when there was sort of inflation pressures coming from wages. So in a sense, we don't have wage controls, but we do, because whenever we see the wages going up a little bit, the Fed says, oh, it's time to act now.
Yeah, they said this explicitly. If you read the transcripts, this was Greenspan's position. Let me say, there's a little bit of justification in it. So the argument was that if firms are increasing prices in order to increase profits, they're going to invest those profits. It's going to increase productive capacity. So in a way, it's sort of self-limiting. The price increases are temporary until the new capacity gets used. That was the justification. On the other hand, raising wages doesn't increase workers' productivity. And therefore, we're going to fight that. Well, now that one is a bit flawed. Higher wages, as Janet Yellen wrote papers on this, happy workers make better workers. And so there is some productivity impact on the workers directly, but also indirectly, because rising wages induce firms to invest to reduce labor costs, which is not a bad thing as long as we're always creating more jobs for workers. So in other words, you displace some workers, replace them with machines, that's okay, as long as the economy is creating more jobs for those workers that get displaced. And that's how you increase labor productivity. But in addition to what Yeva just said, let me say, so we have these surveys of firms, and we ask them, are your sales exceptionally high now? Is that why prices are going up? In other words, is it too much demand? And the firms, you can look at the data, and actually they say, no, sales are just slightly above normal, just as they always are, which is sort of strange. But if you look at the data, sales are almost always slightly above normal, and that's where they are right now. So they're normal. You ask them, do you think that sales in the near future are going to rise and put pressure on prices? And the answer is no. Expected sales in the future are just normal. You look at capacity utilization rates right now. Capacity utilization rates have been on a downward trend for decades. And what this means is, if you look at the peak capacity utilization rate, it used to get up into the high 80s. Now it only gets up into the high 70s. So we're only operating at a high 70% of capacity. You can't operate at 100% on a continual basis, but you certainly can operate closer to 90%. So capacity utilization rates tell us we're nowhere near operating at full capacity. So there are many reasons to believe that there really isn't demand pressure on firms. There really isn't pressure of finding workers, as I already mentioned. Firms aren't very worried about that. So you just can't see where the price pressures are supposed to be coming from and call those too much demand. The price pressures we see, we've already talked about. It's OPEC. That has nothing to do with too much demand.
There's something that really confuses me about the whole focus on demand, on inflation. We always see inflation framed as an issue of excess demand, but excess demand explicitly generated by wages, and the role of credit is almost completely ignored. Do they understand the role of credit in generating this demand, and credit as part of investment as well, potentially generating more productive capacity, as you were saying? And so kind of this dual role. And do they assign the same thing to government investment, but they simply do not have the tools to address those things? Or do they just simply not understand these things at all?
I think the problem is that economists of lots of stripes, and I would include a lot of heterodox economists here too, take a far too high in the sky view of inflation being driven by aggregate demand. I think what you have to do is look at, what are the components that actually contribute to inflation. And what you see in the case of the United States is outside of World War II, you just cannot see this. You can't find aggregate demand causing inflation in the case of the United States. Our high inflation always comes from very particular components of the consumer price index. And there's no reason to believe that the inflation of those components is caused by excessive aggregate demand.
I guess part of the problem would be, what would be excess demand? Is it beyond 100% capacity or beyond 90% capacity?
So the way I think people like Larry Summers are looking at it is they're looking at potential GDP. And there are many issues with how you measure potential GDP. And what we see, so in the United States, it's the Congressional Budget Office that makes this estimates of potential GDP. So that's our sort of limit, right? That once we reach that, then we have too much. And if demand is more than that, then we have a problem of excess demand. There are, of course, problems with how you estimate that. In particular, if you're looking at the question of unemployment, what is the full employment level of unemployment? Is it 3%, 4%? So then you say, well, if, the natural rate is 4%, and once we reach that, we have sort of reached our potential GDP, and then we have a problem. But what we see time and again is that this potential gets revised all the time. And whenever we have recessions, it gets revised downward. So in July of 2020, the CBO revised our estimates of potential GDP downward. And then in February, I think, of 2021, they revised it back upward. And that's because of the actual economic performance. So in a sense, this potential, for it to be any useful for us to understand whether demand is excessive or not, whatever, it has to be independent of the actual economic performance to some extent, right? But if the economy is not doing well, we lower our potential. And then if the economy is doing well, we increase our potential, right? And then as a guide to policy, it becomes kind of useless. So in the aftermath of the Great Recession, we kept lowering our estimates of potential GDP. And then at some point in 2014 or so, when we finally reached our potential or got close to potential GDP, and again, I might be wrong on the years there, but a large part of why we had gotten close was because of us lowering our estimate of the potential rather than actual GDP increasing. So we closed like half of that gap between the potential and the actual by lowering the estimate of the potential rather than actually increasing the actual GDP. And if you can sort of, say, well, if your potential is going to decrease very quickly in a very short period of time, but you know that the actual ability of the economy to produce hasn't really decreased, right? Workers haven't disappeared. Factories haven't really disappeared. So how is it that our potential is revised downward so quickly? And then we say, oh, we've reached our potential. Like right now, we have supposedly reached a potential. And hence the argument there is excess demand.
So how is this potential calculation done? Do they just simply do an empirical study of unemployment versus inflation or something like that? Or do they actually look more detail into surveys of capital stock? And is it in any detail at all?
I don't know the answer to that specifically, but I think it's pretty obvious that what they do, they calculate it in the same way that they calculate the NIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or the natural unemployment rate. They look at what unemployment is, and if unemployment is lower, they will lower the natural rate, and when it's higher, they will raise the natural rate because they don't want to be too far off. It's clear that's what they do.
They just assume we're at full employment all the time, basically.
Well, or we're always close, and sometimes we're above, but we're never far below it. So it was always thought to be about 6% in the early 90s. And then we got unemployment down for the first time since the 60s, down to 4, or I think for white males at least, it was 3%, which was the rate it was in the 60s. And so they lowered the natural rate to 4%.
So calculate is too strong a word, really, for what we're talking about.
Yeah, so they have this, idea of what our potential labor force is, and then potentially what kind of labor force participation we can expect, right? And then, like Randy said, there is some estimate of this natural rate of unemployment or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment, or NAIRU, and probably some idea of what an optimal capacity utilization is going to be, and then out of that comes out a number for potential GDP, which of course, if you keep increasing your estimate of the natural rate of unemployment as actual unemployment goes up, then you're going to lower your estimate for potential GDP, and then you're going to, like Randy said, close that GDP gap or get very close to doing so. But one thing we show in our paper is that in recent years, even when actual GDP has gone over the potential GDP, we still have not seen inflation accelerate or go up.
Yeah, and let me add, there also is, over the past 20 years or more, as the unemployment rate goes down, there is no pressure on inflation. Zero.
So to sum up, the sources of the price rises are coming from supply chain disruption from the pandemic and monopolistic and oligopolistic price setting power. And for anybody that thinks that that's just anecdotal, well, really, the problem there is that CEOs keep bragging about their price setting power on the record. So we've got those things playing into it. At the end of your paper, you write, what can the Fed do? One of our regular guests, Phil Armstrong, calls it one club golf. They've just got this one thing that they can pull out of the golf bag. And other people have commented, yes, and also they are using the wrong end of the golf club as well to draw out the metaphor even further. But tell us about that section. Tell us about the what can the Fed do section.
Well, let me say it's much worse than that. Because at least with the club, you probably could get the ball to move in a direction more or less where you want it to go. And it's not clear at all that you can do that by manipulating the overnight interest rate, what we call the Fed funds rate in the U.S., and many countries call it the bank rate. It's not clear at all. As Warren Moser always says, they don't know if they're stepping on the brake or the gas pedal. I think Dimitri and I put this in our paper. If you ask any economist, what happens if oil prices go up? Well, inflation will go up. What happens if rents go up? Well, prices and inflation will go up. What happens if wages go up? Well, prices and wages will go up. What happens if interest rates go up? Well, prices and inflation go down. Why? For lots of firms, interest is a bigger cost than any of those other things. So why would they reduce their prices when their interest costs are going up? It just makes no sense.
I was just going to add the bit about the government debt and how raising inflation increases the interest payments that the government is going to make. And that's been also Warren Mosley's argument that if you're raising interest rates, you're raising interest income, just like if you're lowering them in a recession, you're lowering interest income. And I was looking at the CBO estimates, and if you look even at their baseline scenario, if interest rates were to rise just a little bit, so the interest on government debt is going to go up as well, then the government is going to spend something like 1.3% of GDP more in interest costs compared to, say, 2020 or 2019. And that number is just going to go up, right? In other words, we're going to be injecting 1.3% of GDP more interest income into the economy, or even more, right? There were different scenarios. So if the interest rate goes up by more, then that 1.3 can be something like 2% or and so on. And that's quite a lot, right? If you compare it to the Build Back Better plan, if you were to spread that over 8 years, which was the 4 trillion spread over 8 years, that was going to add something like 2% of GDP per year. Maybe if the two plans together, maybe they were going to add 4% of GDP. But the final version, right, that $1.75 trillion, if you were to spread it over 10 years, that was going to be much less than this interest expense that we're adding. And yet nobody, and of course, people were saying like, oh, that could be inflationary, but nobody's saying, well, what about this interest expense that you're going to be injecting into the economy? Isn't that going to be inflationary as well?
One of the channels, for example, at the moment, Russia has increased their interest rate to try and strengthen the ruble to fight sanctions. And I know that's sort of a completely different circumstance to what the US has. I wonder what your view was about that mechanism by which inflation can be brought down by the interest rate.
Well, for some countries that import a lot of necessities that go into the consumer basket, a stronger currency can reduce their rate of inflation, and the interest rate might, in some circumstances, allow them to appreciate their currency. I think for the United States, it's just not going to affect us in a positive way like that. If you're asking, is it going to help Russia? I think that the war is a much bigger influence. They're not going to offset it by raising their interest rate, I don't think.
I'm asking in the context of Russia because it's something that's happened recently, but it's something that is always being considered, for example, in the developing world and especially South America. And I believe Argentina has been, trying to use that and to very little success. And yeah, so that's what's the context. But is there anything, Yeva, that you could add to this?
So the reason why they even need to do that, I think, is because they are issuing bonds denominated in foreign currency. So now they have this dollar obligations like Russia does, and they need to get the dollars, right? And they're raising interest rates as a way to increase the flow of dollars. And in their case, I don't even know if that's even a possibility with all the sanctions. But I think that's one of the reasons for why countries that are issuing debt denominated in foreign currency, whether it's private debt or public debt, then when there is sort of a run on their currency, they feel compelled to raise their interest rates. That's, of course, something that MMT says you shouldn't be doing. You shouldn't be issuing debt in foreign currency, whether it's public or private. And in case of Russia, I was reading that they have actually made efforts since 2014 to try to lower the private borrowing in dollars precisely to avoid this situation.
So let's round off with an MMT-informed policy response. So if you guys were advising policymakers there in the US and here in the UK on how to further manage the recovery in all aspects, but also with regard to price stability, what would you be advocating, Yeva?
Well, I would say we need to be taking a closer look at the supply side of the economy. And there is this argument that Keynesians, and I guess you could lump in post-Keynesians there as well, and there has been this claim that MMT as well ignores the supply side of the economy, which of course is not true. What MMT has said all along is that it's the availability of your real resources that determines how much you can spend and so on and so forth, right? So then what do you do about increasing the availability of those resources? So in the context of, for instance, the Social Security debate, the argument has always been that if you want to provide for your retirees in the future, you need to make investments in your productivity today so that workers will be more productive in the future, and so you can provide for your retirees and so on. But we need to, I think what MMT says is that demand is not a problem. There can always be more demand, and the current experience shows that demand can always be increased, right? The question is, what do you do about supply, and what kind of investments do you make to increase the supply, but also say increase it in a particular way? And that's something that we don't really do much in the United States, and it wasn't always the case, right? So with the New Deal, we didn't have this sort of indiscriminate, we're just going to increase spending and that's how somehow going to solve our problems. We were saying, okay, we need to build a dam because we need a dam, right? Or we need to build tunnels and schools. And so as we are doing that, in the process, we also create jobs, right? So you are not just creating jobs, you're not just increasing demand, you're also directing that demand into particular areas. And I would say that's what we need to do more of. So sort of more planned fiscal policy, if you will, rather than just relying on boosting consumption and just letting chips fall where they might. And job guarantee is, of course, a part of it, but you can go even beyond that and say, okay, the renewable energy is a good example of that, right? It's that you invest in renewable energy today so that you increase your energy independence in the future. And Randy mentioned that we need to increase our independence from other nations in many other ways as well, and not just energy.
Yeah, and to be more specific on the situation we're in. So the pandemic hit, and by the second quarter of 2020, we had lost $2 trillion of GDP. That's a huge hit to the economy. So we got pandemic relief. It wasn't an MMT style policy. What we should have done was to put people to work to help fight the pandemic. But we mailed out checks, and almost all of that was either spent paying overdue bills, paying rents, and went into saving. Our saving rate went up to 26%. It's like a Asian style saving. Then we had the second one, and our spending went up. And so that's when we recovered GDP. It was with the second checks that went out. And so by the end of 2021, we were back to where we had been projected to be. So it was a tremendously deep recession and the quickest recovery by far we have ever had. This is a reason to celebrate, not to worry about inflation and try to fight against it. So we recovered, and now the saving rate is back to normal. It's a 7.4%. People are not spending down their saving. They just are saving at a normal rate. There's no more stimulus coming. Total government spending to prop up people's income is only $70 billion more than it was before the pandemic hit. I suppose this is because more people have retired and gone on Social Security. So in other words, there's no more stimulus coming from the federal government. There's no reason to believe that aggregate demand is going to repeat what it did at the end of last year, which is grow at 10% pace. It's not going to do that because we don't have relief checks anymore. There's no reason to worry that demand is going to outstrip supply. What we need to do, instead of trying to reduce demand, like Yeva said, is focus on the supply side and focus on the supply side for long-run survival, human survival. And that involves transitioning our economy into socially and environmentally sustainable trajectories. And that's going to take a lot of government initiative. So that's where we should be focused for the longer run.
So before we go, we should remind listeners that you are both presenting or teaching at the Levy Institute's 2022 Summer Seminar, which takes place in person at Bard College in New York from the 11th to the 18th of June 2022. And they're still accepting applications for that, as far as I see. Is that right, guys? Could you say a little bit about that?
So the Levy Institute has been running a summer seminar for a number of years. This one is by far the biggest with almost 35 faculty, I think, and we can accommodate 60 students. Applications are still open. Probably we're going to be building a waiting list very soon. We will have reached capacity. But I expect the pandemic is not over, and there will be more disruptions, and there will be some problems of getting visas for some of the foreign students and so on. So I do think that we will move down the waiting list And I definitely welcome some more applications.
I think that's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking with Professors Yeva Nersisyan and Randall Wray, co-authors of many excellent papers, including How to Pay for the Green New Deal and the one we were just talking about today called What's Causing Accelerating Inflation, Pandemic or Policy Response. Guys, it's been a real treat to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us today on the MMT podcast, Yeva Nersisyan and Randall Wray.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That was the MMT podcast with Patricia Pino and Christian Riley. Don't forget, you can support the show through Patreon, starting at $1 a month and get access to patron-only episodes. You can do that by going to patreon.com/MMT podcast. You can also find me on Twitter at MMT podcast, and you can find Patricia on Twitter at Patricia N. Pino, and you can email us at mmtpodcast@outlook.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope to hear from you.